Well, when we talk about St. Thomas of Villanova, we talk about a man who was dedicated not only to the service for the poor. As many of you may know, he was referred to, many of his people in his diocese referred to him as the father of the poor, but he was also a great academician. He was a man who wrote and lectured and really challenged the church of his time to do different things and to look at the world in different ways. And I think you'll find our speaker tonight to be one that really challenges us to how we live out our faith, and how we live out our faith in terms of our political convictions, and how we live out our faith in terms of our own life here in this country. Over the last several weeks, we've heard a lot about the intersection of faith and political issues, from the New York Muslim to the Muslim Quran, not the Quran, that's not what I'm talking about. The mosque, yes, the mosque in New York, and how kind of the faith has both Christian and Muslim faith have kind of collided in that whole thing. I was very happy to hear just before I walked in here that the church down in Florida decided not to go in the direction that they had chosen, which would be a real violation to our own amendments of what we believe is important in this country. And so our responsibility as a faith community really does intersect over and over and over again in our political life, and how we speak out about what we believe and how we live what we believe. And that is really what this whole weekend is about, that we speak out and live what we believe. So whether it's from our political convictions or whether it is from our service convictions, or however we might look at it. But Villanova community is a community dedicated to living out what we believe through our very different faith experiences, and we have a lot of different faith experiences here, how we are able to really intersect and dialogue and speak to each other about the importance of God in our own lives and how God influences our lives. I do want to make a special recognition tonight to our Jewish brothers and sisters who are celebrating a very high holy day for themselves this evening and the last several days. Many of them were not able to join us because of that celebration, but we recognize them and we are with them in prayer and in spirit. And it is important for us to recognize that the many faith experiences we have, we join together to create what we refer to as the Villanova community. One message to our students. He is going to speak for a certain amount of time, and then if time allows, he's going to answer questions. When he finishes speaking does not mean let's get up and leave. Okay? I sometimes feel I have to say that, but sometimes the most interesting dialogue that takes place is during the question period. So I promise you, I will give you all kinds of excuses from classes tomorrow if you need them, but please stay and join in our celebration as we begin our celebration of St. Thomas of Villanova, and let us give a warm welcome to our speaker, E.J. Dionne.
As Father said, in the spirit of St. Thomas of Villanova, who was an educator in the 16th century of Spain, also taught theology and philosophy, we celebrate our commitment to the integration of faith and learning. As Bishop of Valencia, Thomas won titles of almsgiver, father of the poor, and model of bishops. Thomas was grounded in his faith, actually through his parents, and brought up in a Catholic intellectual tradition that encouraged the integration of the practices of faith and religion with charity and concern for the poor, all of which he learned from his parents and his schooling. It is in the spirit of this tradition, the Catholic intellectual tradition, that so inspired St. Thomas of Villanova, and also inspired our speaker today, E.J. Dionne, who holds, in terms of academic degrees, a BA in social studies from Harvard University, where he was elected Phi Beta Kappa, and a PhD in sociology from Balliol College, Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Before joining the Washington Post in 1990 as a political reporter, he spent 14 years at the New York Times covering local, state, and national politics, and also served as a foreign correspondent in Paris, Rome, and Beirut. Dionne began his column for the Washington Post in 1993. He is a university professor at Georgetown University, you know, that Jesuit school not too far from here, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dionne has been a frequent commentator on politics for National Public Radio, ABC's This Week, and NBC's Meet the Press. His book, Why Americans Hate Politics, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was National Book Award nominee. His most recent book, Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith in Politics After the Religious Right. He received the American Political Science Association's annual Carey McWilliams Award in '96 and for major journalistic contribution to the understanding of politics. In 2002, he received the Empathy Award from the Volunteers of America, and in 2004, he won the National Human Services Assembly Award for Excellence by a member of the media. It's in his recent book, In Sold Out, where Dionne claims he is reflecting as a public intellectual, I would say a Catholic public intellectual, on his many years of research, writing, and conversation about religious issues and questions related to religion and politics. What is familiar to some of us in this room is that the credit he affords to his early years when he first encountered the treasure of his Catholic faith from his family and the influence of Catholic education in the continued formation of his intellectual and faith life. I quote from Sold Out. The decision to believe or not to believe is an individual choice. We are all shaped by the traditions in which we are nurtured and by whether we grow to accept, reject, or modify them. Because this is so, it is fair for a reader to ask about the stories that shape the narrative I offer here. My own account would certainly include Sister Genevieve, my 6th grade teacher, who may have had more influence on my views of racial justice and civil rights than anyone else. A warm and lovely woman with a deep Southern drawl, she was teaching us kids in Fall River, Massachusetts, with our sharp New England accents, because, as I always understood the story, she had been kicked out of Louisiana in the 1950s for organizing an integrated First Communion ceremony. She thought all kids were children of God. How could one possibly imagine that the reception of the Eucharist should be organized by race? When I was in high school, I was taught by a remarkable group of Benedictine monks. The head of the monastery, Dom Aelred Graham, spent years in dialogue with Buddhist monks and wrote, long before it became a fashionable topic, a book called Zen Catholicism. He later wrote a fascinating spiritual autobiography, The End of Religion. Reading it, I was struck by how a person could be so open and intellectually serious and at the same time so humble and matter-of-fact about his own simultaneous commitment to Orthodox Catholicism and to a life of spiritual questioning. Religion and politics were matters of constant discussion in our Catholic home when I was growing up. My parents were the sort of Christians who believed that they should behave toward others in the ways their faith prescribed. Their faith was warm and not cold, embracing, not excluding, open-minded, not narrow. My dad, a dentist, set up a free dental clinic for poor kids in our city. Like most in his profession at the time, he was strongly opposed to socialized medicine. Unlike many, he predicted its day would come because members of the medical and dental fraternity he loved, and in parentheses, it was mostly a fraternity then, would be insufficiently generous toward those in need. My mom spent much of her life as a teacher in both public and Catholic schools and as a librarian. One of her great passions was getting kids who didn't have very many books in their homes to learn to love reading. When she died in 1994, students she had taught more than 60 years earlier came to her funeral, as did countless others she had encountered more recently. As you can see, I think it is most appropriate to have E.J. Dionne to honor us on the Feast of St. Thomas of Villanova as someone who represents the Catholic intellectual tradition in its very finest way. And his topic tonight is the Catholic political vocation to make everyone feel guilty about something. As Father Peter said, he doesn't know anything about guilt, but many of us in this room do. Please join me in warmly welcoming E.J. Dionne.
an absolutely wonderful, warm introduction, and thank you for reading those parts about people dear to me, and particularly my parents. Father Peter may not know much about guilt, but at the end of my talk, I hope he knows a lot about forgiveness. I can use, I believe very much in absolution. In fact, my wife sometimes says that I believe very strongly that you can commit sin as long as somebody forgives it. So it's, and Father Peter is a great name for the leader of a Catholic institution. You know, on this rock I will build my university. And Barbara Wall, that was such a warm introduction. Barbara has done enormous amounts of work on Navajo spirituality, and I think probably having her pray up here and sing would be much more enriching and entertaining than my giving a talk, but I am going to try to do my very best. I also want to honor two dear friends who are here in the audience, Kathleen and Bill Davis. Their daughter, Corinne, worked with me for a number of years and still as a colleague. She is just one of the smartest and best people I know. She stopped me from committing a great many errors. She couldn't stop every one of them. And if my three kids turn out like Corinne, I'll be very happy. But it's so nice of you to be here tonight. And to be at St. Thomas of Villanova during service week, and I honor all of you who are about to do the extraordinary things you're going to do. I don't know if how many of you have ever looked up your own excellent website, but St. Thomas of Villanova sounds like a real rebel. He's someone I very much identified with. This from your own website. A priest and Archbishop, Thomas insisted that the material resources of the church should be shared with those in the greatest need. His life was characterized by the love of learning, peacemaking, and as a reformer of the church. Continuing from your website, he emphasized that justice and love are the guiding rules of virtue and learning. Thomas found himself in an ecclesiastical world that was fraught with turmoil, sounds very familiar, and struggles for power. His scathing attacks on his fellow bishops earned him the title of reformer. I read that and I said, I think I'd like this guy. But he was motivated by a genuine desire that church leadership personify the teachings of the Beatitudes in words that are very contemporary. Thomas challenged all within the church to serve the least powerful and to discover love and wisdom in the service of others. Now he did a whole lot of things for the poor, but this one really jumps out at you and from the website. For girls, he provided dowries, enabling them to be married with dignity. I guess today we would call that tuition remission or student aid. And he also said, rejoice then, you poor people, shout for joy, you needy ones, because even if the world holds you in contempt, you are highly valued by your Lord God and the angels. I bet they call this guy a socialist. I thank you for reading from Sold Out. I always like to say my book is one of the only books on religion that's actually sympathetic to religion that begins with a joke. And the joke, and his name came up tonight, I actually first heard this from Archbishop Howard Hubbard of Albany, but it's the story of Mrs. O'Reilly. And Mrs. O'Reilly was being taken to the polls on Election Day by her son. And Mrs. O'Reilly had always voted Democratic. Her son was kind of quite affluent, had done very well in the world, and he called himself an independent, but voted for a lot of Republicans. But he dutifully took his mother to vote. But one day he asked her, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly looked at her son and said, oh, hush. Why should he change his party after all these years? I believe that we are having a lot of conversations in this area because a great many Americans believe he actually has changed his party after all these years. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. This is also, we will celebrate on November the 8th, the 50th anniversary of the election of the first Catholic president of the United States. John Kennedy. And there are two stories I want to tell that I love, just to show us how complex this relationship is between faith and public life. As some of you know, John Kennedy had two among his very close aides were Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Theodore Sorensen. Both of them wrote a lot of his speeches. Both actually were Unitarians, as you know, a very liberal faith. In my Catholic high school, I took a course in comparative Protestantism, and I thought I would do a paper on Unitarians because you might as well go all the way. And God bless the Unitarians. And so they wrote these speeches for Kennedy that were unbelievably Catholic. And they knew that Kennedy's need to balance rallying the Catholic base. He got 80% of the Catholic vote, but not to turn off the others. And there was one day they wrote a speech for Kennedy, and Kennedy had Schlesinger and Sorensen in the room, and he looked at them and he said, "This speech is so Catholic, sometimes I think I'm the only Protestant in this room," said John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president of the United States. And then Mario Cuomo used to tell a great story about a member of the Albany machine. Democrat had a very powerful Democratic machine going back to 1919. And he told of a very devout machine politician who would go into church every day and say, "Dear Lord, give me health and strength, I'll steal the rest." So there are many paths to the Lord and many roads in this area. I do want to talk about guilt today. I prove that I'm a Catholic. I actually think guilt is socially useful. I think a lot of us have a lot to feel guilty about. And I want to make a case, actually, that guilt is finally constructive. Guilt actually contains the seeds of hope. Because it comes from the idea that you can do better, that you ought to do better, that you're not living up to what you should. I do want to honor our Jewish brothers and sisters who are here tonight. Shana Tova to you. I once thought as a fundraising technique in Washington that we would have a debate between two Catholics with an excellent sense of humor and two Jews with an excellent sense of humor, and we would argue about which was worse, Catholic guilt or Jewish guilt. And I asked a Southern Baptist friend who comes up later in this talk if she might moderate it, and she said, "Oh no, you do not know how serious Southern Baptist guilt is." So we all have this. But the theory of my talk is, speaking as a Catholic, is that I really do believe that the Church's mission is to make all of us feel guilty about something, and that the Church goes off the rails when it makes one side in politics or the other does not sort of tend to making each side feel sufficiently guilty about the things they ought to feel guilty about. I speak here unapologetically as a liberal or a progressive Catholic, as some of my secular liberal friends and some of my conservative Catholic friends think liberal Catholic is an oxymoron. I don't. And I speak as someone who loves the Church, I think, as much as our conservative friends do, and I think those of us who are progressive Catholics feel an enormous debt for its moral guidance, for opening up the possibility of faith, and for passing along the inspiration of Christian hope. I must say that over the years, the disdain that some liberals showed toward the Catholic Church and other churches really did bother me, especially because I came to my own basically liberal views largely because of, not despite, Christianity and the Catholic Church. As Pope John Paul II said over and over, it's impossible to be a Christian and to remain indifferent to the suffering created by unjust social structures. A few months before his death, John Paul called upon us to advance a radical commitment to justice and a more attentive and determined display of solidarity. My own political views are shaped very much by those demands, even if they reflect them very, very imperfectly. Long ago, C.S. Lewis had a good warning on this subject of religion and politics. He said, "Most of us are not really approaching the subject in order to find out what Christianity says. We are approaching it in the hope of finding support from Christianity for the views of our own party." I know I can be as guilty as this as anyone, but I don't think progressive Catholics are asking the Church to turn itself into some kind of liberal or democratic machine. On the contrary, its moral voice is especially powerful when it challenges both sides, all sides, in the political debate. The theologian H. Richard Niebuhr wrote that radical monotheism dethrones all absolutes short of the principle of being itself. I think, oddly, believers may be less credulous and naive than unbelievers, or at least at times, or at least if they're living up to their creed, when it comes to worldly institutions and systems of thought. So I think that the believer should always regard this world's institutions and systems as inadequate. In principle, the believer should be an active critic of what is, not a passive follower of whatever might be in fashion. It doesn't always happen this way because believers can use our vocation as critics when power and privilege come our way. We discover that we can dethrone all absolutes except the ones that benefit us. Now, in questioning some elements of liberal orthodoxy, I think the Catholic Church has done a valuable service. There is, for example, a powerful link between the moral behavior of individuals and the kind of society we create. A family breakdown is causing enough problems for enough children that we really do need to think a lot about family values. I have always believed that social justice requires family values, and family values require social justice. And by the way, I do not believe that the phrase family values should ever be used as a cover for hostility to our brothers and sisters who are gay and lesbian. Family values, thank you. Family values is about the love and obligation that we feel toward each other. And just parenthetically speaking, as a heterosexual married guy, it always struck me that the problems in the family and the problems of marriage owe a lot more to those of us who are heterosexual and our failures than to our friends who are gay or lesbian. And so I think that in this kind of area, the church has been a powerful voice, and it is right to call us to account in this sphere. Ideally, I think the church's role in politics is to cause discomfort, to encourage questions, to challenge narrowly ideological views. That's why I say it should make us all feel guilty about something. And oddly, a church that is seen as dogmatic has often been a moderating force in politics as a result. Conservative Catholics who cheer the church's stance on abortion are affected, or ought to be, by what it says about war and peace and social justice and the death penalty. They are pushed away from narrowly ideological conservatism. Liberal Catholics who cheer what the church says about social justice and just war are affected by what it says about abortion and family life and assisted suicide. They are pushed away from a narrowly ideological liberalism. Now, think of what this means for each of our political parties. Catholic Democrats are, or should be, sometimes a radicalizing force on social justice, but also a moderating force within their party on family issues, abortion, and assisted suicide. Catholic Republicans ought to be a moderating force in resisting a sink-or-swim free market, in insisting that our leaders exercise moral caution before marching us off to war. Catholic Democrats and Republicans alike call attention to the importance of mediating structures, of solidarity and subsidiarity, of the importance of both personal and social responsibility. In other words, in my ideal world, the Catholic Church would not endorse my own political choices necessarily, but neither would it become part of the other party's political machine. My sense is the church's ideal role is to be a ginger group, to use a lovely British term, a kind of leaven in each coalition. Those of us who are Catholic are, as William Bowl argued in Commonweal some years ago, soft communitarians. We are likely to find ourselves quite loyally, but not always comfortably, supporting our respective political parties. Discomfort is not a bad thing. A bit of discomfort may be exactly what contemporary politics needs, although not the kind of discomfort some of us feel these days watching the television. But if the church causes discomfort only to one side in this debate, when both sides are in need of repentance and absolution, it is not being the church. It is not good enough, I believe, for Catholic leaders to point to a long list of issues on which the church's stand is, by any rational measure, progressive. At election time, if all those progressive issues are ignored by the church's most powerful spokespeople, or are spoken of in only a soft voice, then by the default of some and the intention of others, the church will inevitably be seen as taking a partisan stand. If the only non-negotiable issues happen to be in only one party's political platform, what conclusions are one to draw about where the church stands? Yes, this is a complex business. I devoutly believe that one can be a conservative and be a good Christian, or that one can be a progressive and be a good Christian. One can be a moderate and be a good Christian. We know of our obligation, as the political scientist Glenn Tinder put it, both to give and receive help on the road to truth. I understand the frustrations of so many pro-lifers with my fellow progressives and liberals. I understand the commitment of political conservatives to finding a path to compassion and love. I understand that many good people in the church speak out about problems with both parties. But yes, I am worried. I do not presume to know how God would vote, despite my Mrs. O'Reilly story, and I don't think anyone else should presume so either. Now, there's a larger point here, I think, for both the left and the right, that far from standing up for the status quo, the religious faith, as I've said, should hold us to higher standards. Throughout our history, our great religious traditions, and this is especially obvious in the Jewish and Christian scriptures with which I am most familiar, have preached a message of hope for more just and decent human arrangements. Linking religion too closely to the fortunes of one political party, one leader, is always a mistake. It encourages alienation from faith itself by turning a concern with the ultimate into a prop for temporal power. Reducing religion and politics to a narrow set of public issues amounts to a great sellout of our traditions. It is a great sellout, I believe, to insist that our faith has much to teach us about abortion or gay marriage, but little useful to say about social justice, foreign policy, the organization of our work lives, or our approach to providing for the old, the sick, and the desperate. Religion becomes less relevant to public life when its role is marginalized to a predetermined list of values issues, and when its voice is silenced or softened on the central problems facing our country and our government. I love that term, values issues. Some of you may remember the exit poll from the 2004 campaign, where people were given a nice list of issues to check, why did you vote the way you did? And you could say the economy, you could say Iraq, you could say education, a number of other issues, or you could say moral values. Now, I've asked this for many years now. I want to ask this audience, is there anyone here who cast their ballot in that election or the last election on the basis of immoral values? I have been waiting for years, since 2004, for someone to say yes, so that I could invite them out for a drink after the talk. We could have a lot of fun. No one believes they vote on the basis of immoral values, but think of how that split works. If you cared about your kids' education or the education of other kids in the society, but didn't check the moral values box, you weren't a moral voter. If you cared about economic justice, but didn't check the moral values box, you didn't care about moral values. If you were opposed to the Iraq War on moral grounds, or if you believed we had an obligation to fight it and didn't check the moral values box, you weren't a moral values voter. There's something wrong with the way in which we have narrowed the meaning of moral, the words moral and values in politics, and I hope we can broaden that out over time. I said earlier that I sort of became a progressive or a liberal because of my faith, and I think especially in the United States, there have been important affinities between religion and liberalism that defied the patterns of the old world in Europe. Precisely because we Americans did not experience the religious wars as Europe did, American liberalism was always more tempered in its attitude toward faith than the European, and perhaps especially the French variety. By and large, religious Americans returned liberalism's favor, embracing the regime of liberty and pluralism. The conflict between liberalism and religion over the last 3 decades, in other words, is actually a break from our history, and an anachronistic replay of Europe's 19th century fights. Indeed, American liberalism cannot be understood apart from an understanding of its religious sources. John Dewey, the great rationalist nurtured in New England Congregationalism, from which he later drifted, talked about the great fundamentalist William Jennings Bryan as the backbone of philanthropic social interest, of social reform through political action, of pacifism, of popular education. Today, Bryan is best known for his passionate opposition to Darwin and evolution. But it was Bryan, as his biographer Mike Kazin said, who transformed his party from a bulwark of conservatism into a bastion of anti-corporate progressivism. Bryan preached a simple, pragmatic gospel. Kazin wrote, "Only mobilized citizens imbued with Christian morality could save the nation from predatory interests and the individuals who did their bidding." Gary Wills noted the long list of causes that Bryan championed in their very early stages. They included women's suffrage, the federal income tax, railroad regulation, currency reform, initiative and referendum, the creation of a Department of Labor, campaign finance reform, and opposition to capital punishment. Now, Bryan's progressivism was not eccentric among religious believers. The social gospel arose in the early 20th century from the reflection of religious social workers and activists confronting the contradictions between the promises of God's kingdom and the conditions in the slums. Advocates of the social gospel were among those who cheered Theodore Roosevelt when he declared at the Progressive Party convention in 1912, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." And unlike certain recent rallies we have seen, the Lord, in this case, was considered to be on the side of the progressives. And our own Catholic Church has been a powerful voice for social justice going all the way back to the Catholic Bishop's 1919 program of social reconstruction. There's a radical term, social reconstruction. They were probably called socialists too. And their program was in many ways at the forefront of the thinking that led to the New Deal. I think there's something else about the Catholic tradition that's important. The Catholic Church is often seen as anti-modern. In fact, the Catholic Church, at its best, lives in dynamic tension with modernity, and that is quite different from being opposed to the modern world. You may remember Pope Benedict's famous speech in Regensburg, Germany, which drew so much fire for its comments on Muslims, and I confess, as a columnist, I was critical of that aspect of that speech. And yet that speech included a powerful acknowledgement of the contributions of the age of wisdom and enlightenment to the church and the world. Benedict argued that his critique of modern reason was a critique from within and has nothing to do with putting the clock back to the time before the Enlightenment or rejecting the insights of the modern age. We are all grateful, Benedict said, for the marvelous possibilities that it has opened for mankind and for the progress in humanity that has been granted to us. The scientific ethos is the will to be obedient to the truth, Benedict said, and as such it embodies an attitude which reflects one of the basic tenets of Christianity. The intention here is not one of retrenchment or negative criticism, but of broadening our concept of reason and its application. If Pope Benedict, that staunch defender of orthodoxy, is open and explicit in acknowledging his traditions, our traditions' debt to the positive aspects of modernity, doing so ought not be so difficult for other believers. I believe that religion is necessarily both conservative and progressive. Religion is rooted in tradition and survives through the development and change within that tradition. It applies old truths to new circumstances. It also re-examines old truths in light of new circumstances. The conservative insists that the tradition not be distorted merely to accommodate passing fads and fashions. The progressive insists on purifying and clarifying the tradition by freeing it from the distortions and cultural incrustations of the past. The conservative keeps tradition alive by honoring it. The progressive keeps tradition alive by adapting it and sometimes by challenging it. The history of American democracy shows that religious liberals and religious conservatives, and I would say more broadly left and right, need each other more than they know. We forget that at polarized moments like this one. We especially forget it in the run-up to elections, but that doesn't make our need for each other any less real or compelling. We might come together more than we do around Catholic social teaching, which really is the Church's hidden treasure. That Baptist friend I mentioned earlier, who wouldn't moderate my debate about guilt, it teaches at a divinity school, and she says the most exciting class she teaches every year is when she introduces her mostly Protestant students to Catholic social teaching. She sees Catholic social thought and its insistence on social justice as a gift to the entire Christian tradition. It's a carefully thought through system of ideas that links charity, justice, social action, and public policy. This proud daughter of the Southern Baptist tradition would not think for an instant of changing churches, but she sees in Catholic social thought a set of rigorously grounded commitments that enrich us all. A Jewish friend who does not consider himself much of a believer at all came away delighted with Pope Benedict's recent encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, seeing it as one of the best moral critiques he had encountered of the underlying causes of the recent financial crisis. I had great fun when President Obama visited Pope Benedict, and of course everyone was thinking Benedict will criticize him on abortion or some other issue. And I noted that Pope Benedict's encyclical on the economy actually put him well to the left of President Obama on economic questions, and it would be fascinating to see Pope Benedict criticizing Barack Obama from the left. And that's how my friend read this papal encyclical, and I never heard him quote a religious document with such passion or enthusiasm. Now, I bring up my two friends not to engage in a progressive version of Catholic triumphalism, but to suggest something quite different, that rank-and-file Catholics do not appreciate the splendor of what the Church teaches about how to build a more just society rooted in the common good. It should be something of a scandal that our friends and collaborators outside the Church often have spent far more time pondering the implications of Catholic social thought than we Catholics have. At Georgetown, where I teach, some of my very best Catholic students speak of never having encountered the Church's social tradition in their religious education classes. Of course, they know where the Church stands on abortion, but that it has a great deal to say, and has said it over many years, about economic justice, social welfare, and the God-given dignity of all human beings after they are born, surprises a great many of them. And so I want to close with a plug for a new book by Father Larry Snyder, who is the president of Catholic Charities USA. He's somebody I would suggest you have come here. He's a lovely man, and he has taken on the task of updating Catholic social thought in light of Benedict's teaching, in light of his experience working with poor people around our country, and bringing it back to life for a church that should be doing much more to carry its social message to the world. Incidentally, I want to say one thing in passing. There are some people, there are certain priests, I'm sure Augustinians do, the folks who really talk a lot about Catholic social teaching are the nuns. During the healthcare fight, one of the most important columns I will ever write, it was during the healthcare fight, and I wrote under the headline, "Listen to the Nuns," which I thought would resonate with a lot of Catholic politicians in Congress. But the nuns live very close to the poor, to the sick. They are the people who carry out the work the Church asks us all to perform, and especially with the closing of the Catholic schools, the declining vocations to the sisterhood, a lot of us don't encounter as many nuns as we used to. But I do want to note that if there are missionaries for Catholic social thought, they are it. Father Larry Snyder, who also loves the nuns as much as I do, has offered this argument in his book called Think and Act Anew. It's very contemporary in its argument. It relentlessly cuts through the rigid categories to which our contemporary debate is enslaved. And it's stubbornly practical in offering remedies that have promise for the here and now. And I won't go into detail except on one of them, but I think Catholic social thought has always been at its best when it carried its message not simply to Catholics, but to society as a whole, to my Baptist and Jewish friends and thousands like them, and to millions of Americans who are searching for a morally coherent approach to economic justice in the wake of the great financial crisis that bred the Great Recession. There is and long has been a Catholic third way that respects the market's role but does not deify any economic system and acknowledges the market's shortcomings. The Catholic third way asserts an important role for government in fostering social justice. Catholics are not government haters, or at least they shouldn't be. But it also celebrates the indispensable role played by organizations outside government in building communities, strengthening social bonds, and delivering assistance in ways that government cannot. Father Snyder offers 4 economic principles that I rather like. First, the market must not be a place where the strong subdue the weak. Economics and finance are not themselves dangerous instruments, but they become so when they are used for purely selfish ends. Second, we recognize that the market is an effective tool, and it can be a beneficial one for the exchange of goods and services that give us what we need and want. But it is also subject to distributive justice and social justice because there is a broader social and political context in which it must operate and needs to function. Third, every economic decision has a moral consequence. After the last 2 years, you don't have to elaborate on that one. And finally, in the words of Pope Benedict, the economy needs ethics in order to function correctly. Not any ethics whatsoever, but an ethics which is people-centered. Now, anyone, including non-Catholics, looking for a place to start the debate we need to have in the wake of this financial crisis would do well to start here. For those who work with our poorest citizens every day, for those of you who are going to go out and volunteer this weekend, people like Father Snyder, people like the nuns, people who work in secular as well as religious nonprofits. For them, the poor are not abstractions or stereotypes or stick figures. They are living, breathing, dignified children of God, crying out for justice and opportunity. They seek not charity but a chance, not sympathy but empathy, not pity but respect. In the course of Think and Act Anew, Father Snyder offers this one idea which I do want to pass along. He says, the highest form of charity is not a handout but a loan. Extending a loan treats the recipient as a peer who participates in this transaction by the promise of repayment. The individual's dignity is respected with no danger of subservience or dependency. Now, is this a liberal or a conservative thought? Is it a left idea or a right idea? To ask the question is to see immediately how irrelevant it is. But how many people are even thinking now about the importance of providing the poorest among us not only with incomes, but also with capital? How often have we heard voices trying to blame our recent economic catastrophe on the efforts of the less well-off to acquire property by way of distracting attention from market manipulations that left the most financially privileged with millions or even billions in the bank? The Catholic Catholic social teaching is rooted in 2 wonderful ideas. Again, we don't talk about them enough. Solidarity is one of them. Solidarity is a familiar word to people here who are in the trade union movement. It's a familiar word for people who listen to John Paul's speeches, as I used to do when I covered the Vatican. It's a really simple idea. It teaches us that our obligations to each other, it teaches us about our obligations to each other and underscores the extent to which we are embedded in a network, which might simply be a high-tech name for the mystical body of Christ. Remember that? That binds each of us to all of us. It is not, John Paul said, a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit themselves to the common good. Subsidiarity teaches us that aid in social action is best carried out close to the ground. If centralization cannot be avoided, it should be a last resort. My friend Mike Lacey and a colleague Bill Shea had a rather jaunty definition of subsidiarity. They wrote, "It can be understood minimally to say, ask for help when you need it, give when asked, but don't spoil yourself or anyone else. Take care of your own business, and don't be an intrusive busybody." That is good advice, and it leads to excellent social policy. Now, there's a dangerous tendency in our debates about poverty to talk about whether the emphasis should be on personal or social responsibility. We either ascribe poverty to individual failures, or we insist that all poverty is caused by social and economic injustices. But what both common sense and Catholic social teaching tell us is that personal responsibility and social responsibility are indivisible, that social responsibility and charity themselves are a form of personal responsibility. And it is foolish to deny either the individual's moral obligation to the improvement of self and family, or our collective obligation to break down barriers to advancement, to battle discrimination, to dismantle unjust social structures. Social justice requires both individual and social action. Now, in ending this talk, it is impossible to discuss justice in a Catholic context without noting the Church itself has been racked by injustices of its own, none more searing or enraging than the child abuse scandal. For some, it is impossible to think about Catholicism now without thinking about the scandal. The institution's handling of episodes in which the young and the innocent suffered grievously at the hands of those in authority drove millions away from the Church and enraged millions of others who have struggled to remain faithful. The Church still needs to come to terms with the impact of the scandal and to grapple forthrightly with its own institutional failures. But it will thrive again if it remembers its own teachings, if it remembers its obligations to speak not to a narrow set of questions, but to its largest obligations to society, to humanity, and to God. It has helped many Catholics to remember that the Church is more than a few leaders. I don't know how many of you saw it, but I was very moved one day when I picked up my New York Times and started reading a column by Nick Kristof, who's been a great witness on behalf of suffering people all over the world. And Nick spoke of and I quote him, a grassroots Catholic Church that does far more good in the world than it ever gets credit for. And I quote him, "This is the Church that supports extraordinary aid organizations like Catholic Relief Services and Caritas, saving lives every day, that operates superb schools that provide needy children an escalator out of poverty. This is the Church of the nuns and priests in the Congo, toiling in obscurity to feed and educate children. This is the Church of the Maryknoll Sisters in Central America and the Cabrini Sisters in Africa. It is the Church of those of you from Villanova who are going to go out into your community and render service. It is the Church that all of us, liberal and conservative and moderate and apolitical, can actually look at with pride." A Catholic prelate commenting on the Church's own failures once told a dictator who was waging war in the Church, "Why do you think you will destroy the Catholic Church? We've done everything we could to destroy it ourselves, and we've failed. What makes you think you'll succeed?" This is a church that can withstand many things if it lives by those principles. We'll prosper as a church and as individuals if we remember the lessons of humility, hope, and love. As I said at the beginning, guilt is often seen as leading to despair and, God forbid, to low self-esteem. But guilt contains the seeds of hope. It is the sense that we can do better and should be doing better. That Catholic president elected 50 years ago campaigned on the slogan, "We can do better." In the long run, faith should unite us, not divide us. It should lead us to complacency, not to complacency, but to action, not to arrogance, but to an acceptance of our public responsibilities, not to a certainty that God is on our side, but to a humble quest to act in a godly way in an imperfect world whose betterment requires us to act in hope. Faith and hope should promote in us a glorious dissatisfaction with the world as it is, so that we may envision the world as it might be. Self-satisfaction is not the call of faith. Martin Luther King Jr. drew on the prophet Amos in that famous speech offering his own dream. We are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That is the standard of faith. That is the obligation of those who declare their allegiance to a just and loving God. Thank you very much.